Good evening. This is Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with Dave Frank. We have lots of national news to discuss today. We'll start with the pending infrastructure and Build Back Better deal. It does look like things are happening. There's a few sticking points left. Apparently, there is some movement on the funding. While they aren't going to increase the tax rates corporate tax rates as they were talking about, they are going to increase the floor, the minimum tax rate, it sounds like. And apparently, however they're going to structure it, it seems like Sinema and Manchin are agreeable to that. It could raise as much as $400 billion, which is not insignificant. That's about a fifth of what they'll need to raise. It looks like they may agree to a methane tax, even if they won't agree to a carbon tax. That's somewhat helpful, although it's a long ways from what we need over the next decade for carbon and emissions reduction. But it's something. A number of other things that they are discussing. The real sticking point is the Medicare expansion that is really being pushed heavily by Sanders, wanting to go into dental, vision, and other things. Manchin is saying we can't put Medicare's solvents at risk. Report had said that it could be insolvent by 2026, according to some report, and Sanders is, according to one headline, has drawn a red line in the sand. We can finance it if you would put pressure on Sinema to back allowing the Medicare to negotiate price reductions with drugs with the pharmaceutical companies. Have market forces actually apply to pharmaceutical companies? How socialist is that, right? But Sinema has been absolutely opposed to that, wanting to basically have pharmaceutical companies continue to dictate prices to Medicare, and but they could make up that, not only cover the Medicare expansion, but solve the insolvency problem. So that is a sticking point. There are a few other issues that they're working on. They're also talking about a billionaire wealth tax, which has Elon Musk screaming, but not many other people. It seems like it doesn't seem to be a lot of opposition from Manchin and Sinema, at least not yet. They tend to wait, though. They tend to wait to the last minute before they object. Hasn't been a lot of lobbying from billionaires, so we'll see. But it does seem to be coming together. There was a bit of pressure to pass the infrastructure bill because there's been a lot of stories about contractors, wanting to make bids on jobs. Now, as we're getting into the winter, they want to start planning for when the construction jobs start up again in the spring, and they can't do it. And so there's pressure to pass it before, and we'll get the reconciliation bill passed in a few days, and just trust us. And the Payapal and Sanders said, no, we're not going there. We'll give you a few hours lead time, but not a few days. We want this done. And so they are working on a lot of details. What would this billionaire wealth tax look like? I think a lot of people are kind of freaking out because what does a wealth tax look like? And boy, once they open that door, I'm sure there are a lot of people who are a bit worried about that. Not a lot of opposition to the minimum corporate tax, though, which is interesting because there are a lot of corporations that don't pay any taxes at all that might object.
Yeah, so you covered an awful lot of ground there, and I think big picture there is a lot of pressure coming from the White House. We're seeing this diplomacy with in and outdoors. People are going to meet with the president. When I say people, Senator Manchin and Senate and House leadership and Senator Sanders. So they are trying to make sure that the party doesn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Now, granted, there's tremendous frustration, as you pointed out, from progressives about the shrinking of the the wish list to the practical. But a couple highlights. I mean, I think there enough voices are saying we are almost there. Like we all understand the proverbial we. They all understand they need to pass something, and that compromise is happening. And I saw Bernie Sanders out there saying like, okay, well, I don't know if it's actually a red line, but he's saying the number one thing people in this country realize is that, you know, as we are the wealthiest country in the history of the world, and we have a population of seniors who don't have dental, vision, and hearing covered, and that's not acceptable. I don't know that this is necessarily the right forum to make that argument, but this is the line in the sand that appears to be being drawn. And then to complement that, he is also saying, like you alluded to, or actually outright said, that Medicare should ought to be able to negotiate drug prices. But that, like the pharmaceutical industry has over 1,500 lobbyists in DC full time, making sure that that's as weak as possible. So what I think the workaround might be is that they just pick the drugs that are the most popular, the most heavily used, or perhaps those that are the most egregiously priced. So they're coming up with a formulary approach where they pick drugs that are palatable so that the whole sector doesn't take a hit on the chin for its $50 billion a year in annual profits. I think that as a sticking point, the fact that this is where they're sharpening their pencils here, that's telling, because there's room here for negotiation. You also mentioned the pay for it. Like, how are we going to pay for all this? And so some of the things that aren't happening, are a whole slate of potential taxes, and instead that corporate minimum tax is getting traction, and I think that's in part because the administration, the Treasury Department, it's part of a global treaty. They really are trying to get all countries to have a minimum multinational tax, just because it's egregious and unconscionable any other way. Also, that methane tax seems to be not a carbon tax, so there's some traction there too, like you said. And finally, about the trust, about the timing. I saw Ro Khanna on over the weekend, and on one of the shows, and he said, look, we don't actually have to sign them simultaneously, in tandem, side by side. It's not like that. When the president says he's got a firm commitment from Senators Manchin and Sinema, we're going to take the president on face value. Procedurally, we can pass one without the other, temporally, we can do it as long as the commitments are there. And that seems to be like that's what's in play. But I keep hearing this about Senator Manchin. The flip side of that is, Senator Sinema, we keep hearing that there's really nothing there. It's really just a raw move to block taxes on donors and to block pain for the pharmaceutical industry. And she's marching to a different drummer, looking for big pockets for the future payoff, for the future career. No commitment to constituents, no commitment to convictions on the merits of policy debate. This is what we're hearing. And I just think that, the idea is that she'll probably just go along. This is probably self-aggrandizement.
Yeah, no, and that's it. That's what they ran into. And normally they can kind of hide from it, but she's right there in front. There's nobody else with her. The Manchin has his own kind of thing going, but but she has nothing else. She's not talking to the media much, and definitely not talking to any constituents. She's not returning calls, people who supported her before. It is really just raw, naked, just corruption. There's just nothing else to call it. And that's just basically who she is. People are saying, is she going to switch parties? There's no parties. There's nothing there. It's just absolute, we're in there for just a few interests, and that's it. I mean, and that's where we're at. And unfortunately, it's meant that almost most of the visionary stuff is out of that bill. It's just it's money just for more money for kind of the same old. But it's just, and that's a real shame. But that's where we're at.
I know we have minimal time, but I would say one thing that's worth mentioning is folks have said that the infrastructure bill is not an incredible win for Biden to take to the climate summit. He needs the reconciliation bill because that's where some of this, green funding is going to be. Even if the biggest programs are cut out, there's something positive to come from the entirety of both bills. So that's going to, I would say that's why it's going to happen.
Okay, well, there's a lot of talk. There's been a lot of testimony. Of course, the big whistleblower who's probably going to have a book deal, Ms. Hagen, is talking about, impacts on election, impacts on children. We are talking about the industry of social media, which Senator Klobuchar this morning claims is 20% of the U.S. economy. I find that hard to believe, but but anyway, a big part of the U.S. economy that is virtually unregulated, unlike other media. There's no, FCC doing guidelines and the rest. And unfortunately for social media, Mark Zuckerberg has basically taken absolute control. Almost, I mean, he does micromanage this huge thing that's used by a couple billion people, I think, and he's inconsistent. He says, "Oh, we can't really regulate hate speech in the United States." But apparently, he was shutting down opposition speech in Vietnam, according to documents that were on behalf of the government, because he didn't want the Vietnamese government shutting down the Facebook in that country. So apparently, when where it suits his interests, he can control speech. So, not that we necessarily want him to do that, but there are a lot of inconsistencies, and that is apparently the dissatisfaction is bipartisan, and the way people in both parties are talking. So Facebook in particular, and social media in general, is looking at some type of regulation, some type of regulatory framework, and the other media were out there today, particularly because those medias are more popular with children, Instagram and the rest, and it seemed like the members of Congress were getting tired of hearing, well, we're not Facebook as the defense, and they were like saying that's a very low bar, which is probably not something Mark Zuckerberg wants to hear. But it looks like there's at least a mood on Capitol Hill for some type of significant changes. I don't know what's in the pipeline or what it's going to look like, but it does look like a pivotal point in the history of social media. Dave?
Yeah, there's several different angles of this, and it's kind of a slow-moving train wreck over time as we learn more and more about the known harms that come from just how fully unregulated social media has evolved over this very short period of time. But one key principle I think that's worth reiterating is that Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which was 1996, it's considered one of the most valuable tools for protecting freedom of expression and innovation on the internet. It basically, actually I'm quoting, it says, "No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider." So in short, like, they are not being, the platform does not have liability. And so both political parties have tried to say that there's a problem here. One is because of what is included, like the misinformation, disinformation, or hate speech, or white supremacy, nationalism, all that, or what is not included. So Republicans are getting deplatformed, or not just Republicans, but anti-vaxxers or people who are suspicious of government power. They're being, former President Trump. So they're pointing to that as a weapon they could theoretically use to fight against this lack of regulatory structure. But more to the point about the present situation, you talked about whistleblower Frances Haugen. So I saw some testimony to Congress. I read about some testimony to the SEC, also testimony in the UK. And so one of the things that I think is worth bringing out, just an example of like why this whistleblower shows like an actual harm based on Mark Zuckerberg's sort of micromanaging that you alluded to. Back in she testified, Frances Haugen testified that back in 2017, when Facebook decided to add emojis to their platform, they put little, images that correlate to angry, sad, haha, love, and wow, and gave them a 5 times weighting in algorithm suggestions. So that basically, if you just give a like, It's a little bit, it's a preference. Oh, you like, cars, or you like trees. But if you say that makes me angry, it's a 5-time weight. There's a 5 times more likelihood you're going to get more angry. And images, videos, or content that brings you more anger. And so there's a similar dynamic that plays out with the suspicions about young female body image, and how that was harmful to young women, the way that the platform algorithm was functioning. So that they revisited this. The internal documents show they revisited this in 2019, and they said, no, we kind of like it. We kind of like that. Zuckerberg and his allies on his corporate leadership team decided, no, we like what's happening here, because we're making more money, we're getting more people. This is cool. But then obviously 2020, not so cool. Things happened in lead up to the election. They decided to help protect the election. They were going to put these guardrails in place. They lowered that weighting in the algorithm to just 1.5 times. And then after the election, but before January 6th, they took the guardrails back down because they wanted to return to what was working. And not to get super in the weeds, but this is an example of just bad choices or antisocial choices. So maybe regulation isn't going to be the panacea. Maybe regulation isn't going to be fully required. Maybe it's just a function of some commitments to improvement. One last element of just Facebook is that, this is just the United States we're talking about, but around the world, huge percentages of people, that is the internet. Like many countries around the world, the majority of the access points to get online is through Facebook. So they have a different role to play elsewhere. And then that also is worthy of consideration here. Are they going to voluntarily be the most responsible party out there in terms of getting people online into the future? I think there some new conventions, privacy and harm conventions, may do more than just outright micromanagement regulation.
Yeah, in the 1996. Part of that is that they didn't want to have a floodgate of defamation cases. I mean, it's one thing to say, yeah, you can't monitor for every defamatory thing. The interesting thing, though, is it doesn't protect you against copyright protections. They definitely have their protection of their property in there. I question that personally, but that's but defamation. Yeah, defamation of character, they're not expected to be monitoring that. And unless you take it upon yourself to do it, and then once you start doing that, you can get yourself into trouble. Well, you did it for that person. Why aren't you doing it for that person? So they use that as an excuse. We don't do it at all. So, we're not doing it. But that there's a difference between that and trying to moderate hate speech and or threats of violence and things like that, and planning to do violence, and the stuff around the January 6th, and the stuff around just whipping up all kinds of hate that's leading to a climate of the sort of thing, and then the impact on children. Just on all of that, they need to look at it, and the fact is that they had data. That, as Ms. Haugen was saying, they had the data to know what was going on, and they chose to ignore it. I mean, that was, the interesting thing is that, because it was profitable, because they didn't want to spend the money to address it. It wasn't like it couldn't even be addressed. They just chose to ignore it because it wasn't convenient, because they were satisfied with what they had.
And so I know, again, we're wrapping up soon, but there's a couple interesting things here that we maybe could revisit in the future. One is that Facebook is going to change their name. So they know that they got some bad press here. They know they got some house cleaning to do, some perceptions to clean up. But there's anecdotal evidence from some of these folks. I don't recall if it was the whistleblower or other folks talking about it, but that Mark Zuckerberg is focused like a laser beam on the metaverse, which is virtual reality. So Oculus is one of their products. Oculus is virtual reality, and that meaning, like, if people evolve and transition from, say, Facebook to now you just put on VR, well, now you could all travel the world together. You could all sightsee. You could be in a meeting together. You could physically share virtual spaces. And I think he's got a vision on that. So not that he's like the master of the universe or anything, but he's got his eye on the prize, which is to stop the sinking ship of perception. Presumably, there's more older people that say that they still use Facebook. I mean, younger people prefer TikTok, and that's another conversation for another day.
Congress must act. We cannot leave here to go home to our families.
We will not leave this town until we have voted, up or down, until we have voted on direct relief for working people.
Mr. President, you're very aware, because in the committee that we both sit on, we've worked through a process of trying to form an answer to a problem that is coming at us again in 2 weeks. 2 weeks from now, we will hit the end of the fiscal year, which means the countdown clock will begin again towards when we're headed to another government shutdown.
All right, we're going back to January 6th. We've got a couple of developments here happening. One is, once again, Trump is pushing executive privilege. And once again, President Biden is saying, nope, not interested. It's kind of like whack-a-mole at this point. They're pushing it. But we're not going to discuss that quite right. There is actually an explosive Rolling Stone article that you can go read online, in which a couple of the participants, they're anonymous, but a couple of the organizers of the January 6th event and the storming of the Capitol have said they worked closely with Mark Meadows and with one guy said about a dozen, but they've named about half a dozen members of Congress, some of the usual suspects, Boebert and Green and the others, but Gosar, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right. I've only read it. I actually haven't heard it. Gosar actually promised blanket pardons ahead of time, according to these sources, and that his blanket pardons for what? What were they expecting, right? And immediately Monday morning, a number of Democrats were calling for their expulsion from Congress. There's going to be a lot of follow-up. You can bet that this is going to be, a topic of the hearings coming up. Once we get through the reconciliation and the other bill, this is going to be a pretty hot topic. You can bet everybody named in that article is going to be subpoenaed, wonder if there's going to be an attempt to subpoena that from the Rolling Stone. Obviously, these two people probably don't want to be dragged into hearings. I'm really curious as to who they are and what their capacities were. But this is a lot further than just the coming out onto the balcony and putting your thumbs up and having been there. This is like people who they basically said that these people, especially Mark Meadows and a couple of the others, had opportunities to prevent the violence. And they weren't real specific on the details, but a fascinating article. Everybody should go to the Rolling Stone and read this. It's available online for free.
Yeah. So you and I talked about this over the last few weeks and months, and I always sort of don't want to call people out. I figured this would play out over time, and I think now we're starting to finally see behind the curtain that there was a command center across from the White House. I think it's called the Wilbur Hotel. They rented a bunch of suites, and it was Steve Bannon and Rudy Giuliani and former commissioner of the New York Police Department and others in conjunction with, like you said, a dozen congressmen, Congress folks, Paul Gosar, Lauren Boebert, Mo Brooks, Andy Biggs, Marjorie Taylor Greene. They're just some of the ones who had these meetings and coordinated. But the people who are quoted at length in the Rolling Stone magazine, they say they've already started preliminary conversations with the January 6th committee in Congress, and they are willing to speak publicly because they think it's the right thing to do. Not against anybody necessarily. They still support President Trump. They still believe that all of this, they're on the right side of history here, and they want to wonder. They want to know why no one got pardons.
Yeah.
They want to know what went wrong here. They want to a certain extent, they're asking, how did this and why did this turn violent? This wasn't supposed to be violent. All the organizers, everybody involved was told. There was like this parallel track where everybody was just saying, don't worry, we have evidence. We're going to present the evidence. We're going to stop the election. This is a done deal. This is happening. So they want to know, like, where was the evidence that everybody talked about? And I think what's an interesting takeaway is, if you are any of these Congress, members of Congress who are going to get called out, certainly, you're going to say, we were just there to do our responsibility to stop the election, ... whatever their reasoning is. And they were, in a sense, they were sticking with the fabrication so that they could point to the fabrication as their defense. They're saying, we just wanted to prove that there was a problem. We had nothing to do with all the other bad stuff that happened. So when they were giving people tours, or when they were coordinating campaigns, and they were plotting all the micro, Trump's going to come away, and Mark Meadows are going to come away as being at the hub of this strategic plan to sow chaos in the confidence in election outcome. But I think it'll be really interesting, and as more evidence comes out, and these people are actually going to testify and say, we still think Trump won. We still think that we just want the answers. And at some point, there's not going to be answers.
Right. I mean, see, one thing that happens is, if that counting that happens there, the official counting where the vice president does it, if it doesn't happen on that date, the Constitution is violated. It says it's supposed to happen right on such and such a date. And if it gets disrupted and doesn't get, done, finished, I mean, you can finish it into the night and the rest. But if it gets delayed a week, it's not, according to the Constitution. I think it's actually happened a couple of times, but at this point they say the Constitution is violated. Oh man, we need to take a visit this. We need to shut everything down until we know what's going on. I mean, I really do think that Trump was looking for an excuse not to change power until we see what's going on, right? To put off the change of power, and this really was the plan. And there was a whole legal plan. We know this. We know that there was, an actual strategy for it. Whether it was sound or not, it doesn't matter. They had one. It was just, it was goofy, but that was it. We know that Pence was approached with one, and that he actually went and sought, some assistance or some advice from Dan Quayle, of all people, who said, no, that's crazy. I mean, a genius there, who had to tell him, no, you're way out in left field there. And he didn't do it. And he's seen as the turncoat. I mean, but here are people who were hung out to dry. They expected to be pardoned. And where are their pardons?
Yeah, exactly. And I just think it's if it wasn't such a tragedy, it would be interesting. But instead, it's disheartening that there's just this tale of two cities going on here about all of this. And as it plays out, I think that both sides are going to hyper politicize it going into the 2022 election. Yeah. You and I, we keep our lodestone. The point of reference for all this is national politics. And I think that both parties, as they combat 2022 cycle, let's not even talk about 2024 because it's not current enough here. They're going to point to this, and I think that this committee is going to serve that purpose of slow rolling for the Democrats, of slow rolling new evidence, new understandings, new involvement, and maybe Republicans like to use the committee as a foil or this whole process as something to point to. I mean, I did hear Condoleezza Rice recently said, "Oh, we just need to get past that. We just need to get past it." And nothing against her or anybody else who thinks that, but I think both parties have it in their best interest, or they think it's in their best interest to be hyper political here and to use this as a fight. As a fighting point. We may see some of these people actually get punished, not just censor. They might get it might be considered disqualifying behavior to represent in Congress. I don't think it'll go to criminality. I don't know, but I don't think we're going to actually see what's the congressman from Ohio, Jordan?
Jim Jordan. Yeah.
Jordan.
Yeah, he won't be kicked out. No.
Right. But so I don't think it's going to be criminal in any way. It's just there's probably some disqualifying immorality though.
Yeah, they might accidentally gerrymander him out. It wouldn't be hard. He's got that weird-looking district, but we'll see. But I mean, they are a liability to the party. I'm sure the Republicans, wouldn't mind seeing these people gone. It's just, and of course, Trump wants to make the 2020 election the big issue of 2022. I know the Republicans are hating that, but they can't buck him. So they've got that problem. That's their big issue, the problem for 2022 in the committee. I'm sure the Democrats would love that. Anyway, all right. Well, obviously that's going to be an ongoing topic, and we'll probably be covering that as we go along. But that takes us to the end of this segment.
Congress must act. We cannot leave here to go home to our families.
We will not leave this town until we have voted, up or down, until we have voted on direct relief for working people.
Mr. President, you're very aware, because in the committee that we both sit on, we've worked through a process of trying to form an answer to a problem that is coming at us again in 2 weeks. 2 weeks from now, we will hit the end of the fiscal year, which means the countdown clock will begin again towards when we're headed to another government shutdown.
Okay, next topic. This is a bit international, but it is going to have some national political implications, because so far Biden is not, what was supposed to be his strength in international politics, he's not seen as very effective internationally. And of course, this issue has been, what happens with Taiwan. Taiwan is part of China, sort of legally, and there, have been protests. We saw what happened with Hong Kong. Hong Kong's protests, the protesters, those that didn't escape, are being heavily punished. Taiwan is, China definitely just sees it as an extension of their country. There's been a lot of blustering and threats. Biden sort of just said, we will protect Taiwan, which has sent a lot of the advisors kind of scrambling to define that policy. China kind of made a show of force, flying jets over the area. Will we militarily defend Taiwan against China, Dave? I mean, that seems far-fetched, but he did say it.
I think for context, rather than answer directly, I'll answer indirectly kind of how we got here. As a recent article in The Hill pointed out, Biden would be the third president in the last 20 years to declare or strongly imply that the U.S. will defend Taiwan against an attack from China. But he's also the third president to stand corrected by the foreign policy establishment within and outside the government immediately. And the other two are George W. Bush and Donald Trump. So immediately after that, the State Department does the obligatory announcement that U.S. position has not changed. We are guided by the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, which is a commitment to provide Taiwan with the defensive material they need to defend themselves against a forced reunification with China. But there's no commitment on the U.S.'s part to send U.S. troops. So this equilibrium we've had for all this time is called strategic ambiguity. And the intention is to avoid a great power confrontation. But also it's to avoid having Taiwan declare unilaterally their independence. Because like you said, when the nationalists lost the revolutionary civil war within China, that resulted in communist Chinese rule ultimately on the mainland, and the nationalists went to the island, and they've been there ever since. So peaceful reunification is China's stated policy, and they do have a core red line law called the China's anti-secession law. So if Taiwan ever does declare independence, they kind of have they've explicitly said we won't allow that. So the United States has been doing this dance ever since, since 1979, like we talked about. Taiwan even did have a referendum at one point, and they decided not to do it because the United States said, look, we will back off on our commitments to you. But just as a practical matter, the United States has done naval maneuvers there in the last couple of weeks, or even maybe last week, with Australia and the UK and Japan, multiple aircraft carriers, like enough, submarine power to destroy. Just imagine one nuclear U.S. sub with its 24 intercontinental ballistic missiles with 8 warheads can take out 100 and whatever that works out to, 50, 60, 70 cities, completely obliterating them off the face of the earth, anywhere on the earth at any time. And we put a bunch of them over there. So China knows there's not a war. Like they can't go to war with us. That the country will not exist. So the question is, will the United States be willing to go to war? And so I know I'm talking a lot here, but there's an interesting point that I think is worth mentioning. Just last week, U.S. firms signed tens of millions of tons of liquefied natural gas treaties. Contracts with China. We did 700 billion in trade with China in the last 9 months, annualized rate. That's almost 50% more than we did the year before. China holds $1 trillion of U.S. debt, which is treasury debt, which is almost a third of their 3.2 trillion that they have total of all money. So all the foreign reserves that China has in the whole world, they have a 3 trillion, 0.25. They have one of ours. So there's a economic significance to our relationship that's probably stronger than the nationalistic saber rattling, misspeaking that happens on both sides.
Yeah, I'm going to defer to you on this because this is a weak area of my knowledge of world history. How is Taiwan's situation different from Hong Kong's? I mean, Hong Kong was quasi-independent too. I don't know if nationalists went there or if that's a totally different history. I know Chiang Kai-shek did go to Taiwan, and that's where they were. But Hong Kong obviously isn't quite as independent as Taiwan, at least not at this point. What's the difference in the two histories?
So we talked about Taiwan just now, the losing side of the Civil War, and status quo. China still considers it part of China, and so but it's not entirely clear that that's fully true. So that's an equilibrium stalemate. The situation with Hong Kong is very different. Hong Kong was part of the British Empire, so Hong Kong was an autonomous, semi-autonomous zone of the United Kingdom. And they had signed a very far out treaty where they said, someday, and they picked a date. I think my recollection is 1999. Yeah, 1999 or approximately 2000. Someday that China will get it back, and the UK decided to honor that. I at the time didn't think it was going to happen. I figured that the UK would somehow talk about how important it was not to do that, but I think it was part of it's just part of the evolution of world history that they did honor that obligation, and so now it is part of China. So they have that's why they're willing to strong arm the local government there into all sorts of authoritarian, awful oppression.
Yeah, I mean, so how do you think that it's going to heat up anymore, or do you think it'll just peter down like with the other two presidents?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot out there. I try to look at the foreign affairs is the Council of Foreign Relations. You look to that leader, the guy who's the head of that organization, Richard Haass, and he's going to represent NATO and the Atlantic Alliance in his perspective, and he says it's time the United States just overtly. I'm not to project this on him, but the oversimplified version is a lot of people think it's a time that the United States just says, yeah, we'll defend Taiwan. They're an ally. But there's no reason to do it when you don't pick a fight with China and the U.S. are the two biggest economies in the world. China, there's just no reason to pick a fight there. So I just think that everybody's just really attached to the status quo neutrality, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think if there's ever a war between China, it's going to be economic. That's that's where it is. I mean, and we're kind of sort of in one, right? We had this trade war, right? A little bit of skirmish, and the rest. I mean, war isn't profitable in that way. China's got this, does really well with capitalism. So I think the military is just almost there as a way to have public spending. I just don't think that we'll ever be at war with China. I think that it survives to this date that there are no two countries that have McDonald's have ever been at war with each other. I'm surprised that McDonald's hasn't actually made that part of their marketing, but I don't know if that holds to this date. It was true in the 1990s, but I'm not worried about that. And besides which, Taiwan, this is a source of capital. I don't know that there is an interest in them doing what they've done with Hong Kong. I don't know. But it's interesting that this happened. What triggered the more recent, tension around this?
So there's the military side and the foreign policy side, which I talked at length about, which that's just an equilibrium of great powers. But I think the domestic politics is worthy of mentioning right now. From a U.S. perspective, President Biden's got some issues surrounding the withdrawal, the perceptions of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and some other just kind of negativity in general in his PR. And presidents benefit from just strong talk. And so there's that. Biden is the most experienced foreign policy president since, President Eisenhower, who was the leading general of World War II victory. So that's not something to say lightly. But from the China side too, I mean, the nationalists in China are I hate to make a comparison because it's not the same, but it's somewhat cultish. It's hard to wrap your head around the pride, the depths of the pride. Anyway, my point is the domestic politics within China benefit President Xi talking tough, and the domestic politics in the United States benefit any president talking tough.
All right. Okay, well, that takes us to the end of that segment. Thank you, Dave. Okay, well, our last segment for tonight is we've been discussing this. It's a race of very significant of national significance. It's the Virginia race. They've been early voting for the past few weeks. We don't know how that's been going. It is the race between Republican Youngkin, and McAuliffe, who has been successful in Virginia before. And it is very important, and it's been pretty much neck and neck in most polls. McAuliffe has been ahead. Youngkin has been ahead in a couple of recent polls, not by much, but ahead. But mostly it's kind of a dead tie. McAuliffe did kind of do a little bit of a gaffe lately in a recent debate. He made a comment, with all of these things happening at school board meetings with physical threats and even altercations. He made the comment that parents should not run education programs, and that was a crucial mistake. Should not have worded it that way anyway, and that may have cost him some points. That even though there's a negative reaction to the people going there and screaming about masks and critical race theory, even though most people don't even know what critical race theory is, this is something that most people do want to have a say over their children's education, and that kind of sounds elitist and does sound like the state is basically making your decisions for you. So that was a mistake, and will it cost him a whole lot? Who knows? But definitely what he's facing is an enthusiasm gap. Republicans are gung-ho, they're really hot on the anti-vax and anti-mask mandate and the anti-mask stuff. They're energized. The Democrats are tired. They're tired of elections. And in order to energize them, they brought out Obama, gave a fiery speech. Biden's out there this week. They brought people out there to try to get the base going. They did have early voting, and they've been trying to get people out. I don't know how the turnout has been going. I tried to find reports on that. It's a little hard to tell. It's not like California where you can keep track of things as easily. It's a close race. It's neck and neck, and it's a week from today. We'll have a pretty good idea of where it's at. Dave?
Yeah, it's interesting that this is being framed as a proxy for the national tone and temperament in the big fight before the 2022 election cycle. I think that's, these high stakes are there just because it's going to be that data point that people talk to until these races heat up in earnest around the country after the new year. But that explains why former President Obama was out there. And if you listen to some of the talking points he gave in his speech that was just aired over the weekend, he just pointed out a lot of things about the resentment that came from lack of progress during his administration. I would say he was protecting his legacy, and he was saying there's a parallel between the imperfection. He said government is not perfect. We can't pass all the things we want to pass. We can't do all the things we say we want to do. And so if you are resentful or upset or mistrustful as a party member of the party that's not too excited about Joe Biden, don't use that as a reason not to continue to be a party member and vote in effect. He's basically saying, like, we have, he pointed to the election of 2016 and then ultimately to the, January 6th. And he said, this is what we're running against. When I say we, meaning him and his party, Democrats in general. And I just thought that was really interesting. And in light of, what you said about the polls being dead even, the two most recent polls that 538 referenced, the Emerson poll and the Signal poll, they were like within, less than two percentage points, which in a poll with a margin of error, that's the margin of error. And interestingly, a lot of folks have pointed out, well, polling can fall short in this aspect or that aspect. We've covered that at length. I think even last week we covered that some of the technical reasons why polling has been shown to be short. So depending on who the talking head is, they'd say, oh, well, we're really undercounting the enthusiasm of the Democrats, or we're really no one actually speaks to the Republicans because they don't answer the phone as much, and they have institutional resentments and they don't want to participate in your elite polls. And so there's talking about both sides. And the bottom line is, I think that it's always less of a lesson nationally. You can't like Tip O'Neill said, all politics are local. This really is Terry McAuliffe running against Glenn Youngkin. And we have a candidate who's entrenched, I don't want to say royalty, but McAuliffe's been around. He's already been the governor. He was, part of the Clinton team and sort of expects to win, and once he realized it was even close, and got a little hungrier. But the Republicans are hungry right now. So Youngkin's got a wave of enthusiasm that if he were to win, I don't think too many people would be surprised.
Yeah. A lot of interesting things have happened. I will say that one thing McAuliffe does have in his favor is the polls have all been close, but 90% of them do have McAuliffe ahead. It all within the margin of error. But when you see a pattern like that of him 2 points ahead, 3 points ahead, 1 point ahead, it does usually point to kind of a pattern and an advantage. Doesn't necessarily mean he's going to win, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it just does. There is a suggestion there. If it was like back and forth, you would see more. But that statistically speaking, that it does say something, but that it doesn't necessarily mean things aren't changing. And can't change. He's lucky about early voting because the polls were a little bit more in his favor early on. Who knows what's going to happen, but I don't know what percentage of people have already voted or any of that. I was trying to find that before tonight. I couldn't find it. One little anecdote. I mean, there may be a little bit of fatigue around Youngkin. There was an ad out that he released that was something about a decade old, a mom who had complained that her son was just, having nightmares about a book that he was forced to read, a 16-year-old. And it was revealed later that the book was Toni Morrison's Beloved. Now, it's a disturbing book, but it was meant to be. But it's not something that would give you nightmares. It just isn't that bad. I mean, anyway, it's and so when you get ridiculous like that, there is a little bit of backlash to that too. I don't know how many people have read Toni Morrison, but of course they're going to try to frame it. Well, Toni Morrison is brought in as part of that, new stuff, replacing Nathaniel Hawthorne, as one person said, and I remember the debate about that. They said, complaining that Toni Morrison had replaced Nathaniel Hawthorne, and I can't remember the TV show, but it was just brilliant. And the person debating on the other side said, "Have you even read Nathaniel Hawthorne?" It was great, but it was anyway. It's interesting, and so there is a point to that. But we'll see what happens in Virginia. McAuliffe does have the demographics in his favor. The demographics has changed. That's why the Democrats have been winning elections, statewide elections, consistently. And it's just a question of, will they come out?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, that's the deal, right? Like that Northern Virginia area around Washington, D.C. and the suburbs and the exurbs, and that's been increasingly getting more blue and more affluent and arguably a little bit progressive. So you look at that, and the question is it enough? And I think we covered maybe 2 shows ago that it seems to be like Biden won Virginia by 10%. So the overall climate of the state, McAuliffe should win handily. But again, as I said, I don't know if the lesson would really mean much other than that, people in general are frustrated that the Biden administration doesn't have a lot of successes to its name and arguably has a few blunders. There's not a lot of passion or enthusiasm there. But that's not the same thing writ large nationwide. So we'll see next time we connect how it turned out.
This takes us to the last portion of our show. We do predictions. Dave, what have you got for us?
Well, short and sweet. I think Terry McAuliffe wins by somewhere in the order of 5-ish%. I just think that people they when they talk to pollsters, they want to kind of get across the point that they're not fully satisfied. There's about a 5% people that say they're not decided yet. My spidey sense says that's going to be about if it's a tie now, it'll be +5 when reckoning comes after the election.
I agree. I also think there's a really effective get out the vote effort going on. That's what I heard too. I am going to actually say that once we get this reconciliation bill passed and everything goes back to work, I did predict last week that they're going to really lean on Manchin about carving out an exception to the filibuster for the Voting Rights Act. That's going to be the next big discussion. And Manchin hasn't really been saying much about it lately. I also think that Manchin is going to agree to do the debt limit, to extend the debt limitation with reconciliation. I think that there's going to be discussion about that. And then even if it's not there, I think the discussion about filibuster reform is going to become a major part of the Democrats' talk going into the 2022 election. All right. Well, that takes us to the end. We'll see what happens next week. We'll be talking about the aftermath of the reconciliation bill, but then we can stop talking about it. So until next time, keep thinking.